Going to see the second Battle of Bull Run. Now, for the second Battle of Bull Run, I do want to explain it because it takes place on the same battlefield as the first Battle of Bull Run. However, it is considerably bigger. It's considerably wider than the first battlefield. Because for this one, it's going to be taking place in the same area, but a much larger scale. Now, I'm having some issues as far as... Let's see if this works. There we go. Okay. Now, the second Battle of Bull Run is going to take place just a handful of months after the first Battle of Bull Run. Now, there are going to be some other kind of smaller skirmishes in between, but this is going to be the next major conflict. Now, before I really get into what the conflict looks like, we got to talk about the person who's going to be in charge of the Confederacy by this point. We're going to see Robert E. Lee in charge of the Confederate Army. Now, I told you guys before that, yes, Jefferson Davis is the president. But in their system, within their Constitution, their government really has very little power. Jefferson Davis really only has the power to delegate. And he asked Robert E. Lee to be in charge of the Confederate Army. Now, I do want to give you a little bit of background on General Lee, because like I say, he might be the finest military mind really in the Western Hemisphere. He attended West Point. He went to the American Military Academy. And while he was there, he's going to graduate at the top of his class. Now, I want to kind of explain what life is like at the military academies because I didn't attend there, but I had a handful of friends who went to the Air Force Academy. I had a friend who went there, and we played football together. We were wide receivers together, so we were together all the time. This guy was like the most straight, narrow person I've ever met. Everything was just by the book and regimented. When he went off to the Air Force Academy, he was telling me stories about what life is like there. If you don't shine your shoes right, you get a demerit. If your buttons aren't shined correctly, you get a demerit. And demerits can run a bunch of different ways. Demerits can sometimes be, you have extra physical duties, you have to run more or whatever. Sometimes they get really bad, you got to clean the bathrooms with a toothbrush. It depends. That's just what life is like at the military academies. My friend told me after about a month of being there, he finally made his bed the correct way and didn't sleep in it for the rest of the semester. He slept on the floor so he wouldn't mess up his bed again. This is what life is like. It's tough. It's real tough at the military academies. Everything has to be perfect. In 4 years, this guy had 0 demerits. He was perfect. He is maybe the exact soldier that we're looking for. He's brilliant in the way that he conceptualizes the battlefield, where to move troops, where to move artillery. The logistics that he has just in his mind, it's almost like he can see the future. Now, Lee is going to be very, very good at what he does, and he proves it. After he leaves West Point, he goes into the military. He becomes an officer, and he proves himself in the Mexican-American War. A little bit later on, very similar to Jackson, he kind of wants to change his career a bit. So he leaves the military itself, and he goes back to West Point to be a professor. He's a professor at West Point, teaching the generals that will be coming up and fighting against him in this war. Have we heard this before? No. Who else did this? Jackson did this. So as the Union has the students, the Confederacy has the professors. This guy is a worst case scenario for the Union. Both sides thought so highly of him. Abraham Lincoln offered him to be the general of the Union troops first, and he turned it down. Lincoln knows how gifted this guy is. He knows how sharp he is. So he calls him to the White House and he tells him, I believe that war is coming. And when that war comes, I want you to be in charge of the Union Army. He was Lincoln's first pick. When he's given this option, Lee's gonna tell Lincoln, with all due respect, Mr. President, my allegiance is not to the United States. My allegiance is to my home state of Virginia. He resigns right then and there, goes to Virginia, and Jefferson Davis is waiting for him. The finest military mind the United States has ever produced just left the United States and goes to its enemy. Jefferson Davis has this brilliant tacticianer fall in his lap, and he says, I want you to be the commander of the Southern Army. Lee accepts. This is a disaster. This is literally a worst case scenario. As the Union Army is going to be forming again at Bull Run, and the Southern Army is coming to form as well, Lee's in charge. Guess who he sees across the battlefield from him?
His student.
His student. He sees General McClellan across the battlefield, and he says, and that's this quote, he said, well, this should be easy then. It is. A much smaller force going up against a much bigger Union Army. Guess what happens? South wins. South wins again because Lee is just one step ahead of McClellan. Every time, whenever he makes a move, Lee simply counters. McClellan's very defensive. McClellan's not nearly as bold and audacious as Lee is. Lee goes on the offensive and pushes when the time is right. Now again, he has a much smaller army with fewer supplies, fewer artillery pieces. He's really in a rough spot, and he wins again. His tactical knowledge simply crushes the Union. They're forced to run for their lives. They have to run across this tiny little bridge, and it's possible. I say it's possible because odds are probably against it. Maybe if Lee was a bit more aggressive, he could have crushed the Union here. Instead, the Union Army falls back. Now let me ask, if you're a Southerner at this point, are you thinking you can win the war?
Yeah.
Yes. But we also have to kind of think about the other side of this. The other part that I was asking you. If you're a Southerner, could you maybe be thinking too, we got lucky again? Are you thinking that less so now?
Yeah.
Here's the deal. Lee has an opportunity. Maybe now is the time he has to be really aggressive, where he has to push and go north. Maybe now is the time where if he can just string together a couple more victories, more Southerners will join the cause, and even maybe the North might just give up and say, we don't want to deal with this anymore. He's at a crossroads right here. And Lee thinks, maybe this is our opportunity. Maybe now we move north. He sets his sights on going north, out of Virginia and into Maryland, a neighboring state. But there's something you got to keep in mind about Maryland. Is Maryland a Confederate state or a Union state? It's a Union state. But what's a little different about Maryland? Was it yes, Joaquin? It's a slave state that's still loyal to the Union. Now, I will say this. This is a very clever move by Lee at this point. He is literally invading the Union, but he's going into one of those border states. He's going into one of those states that still has slavery. What might happen if Lee wins in Maryland?
Maryland.
Joaquin, go ahead. What do you think?
Maryland will switch sides.
Maybe Maryland switches sides. Now, would that be good news for the South?
Yeah.
Bad news for the North?
Yeah.
What happens if Maryland switches sides?
Capital is in.
That's another problem. D.C. is in between Virginia and Maryland. It's basically right there. That's a big problem. But what else might happen if Maryland joins the Confederacy?
It
about, there are some other border states around. What do you think? Yes, Brian?
The other border states will see that and say, hey, the Union's really vulnerable, we should probably switch now.
Maybe the Confederacy's gonna win this war. We better be on the right side here. Let's join the Confederacy. This is the pressure that Lee's putting on the Union. This is actually a very clever idea. McClellan again is gonna face off against Lee. Now I should tell you this. McClellan gets a stroke of good luck right before the Battle of Antietam. A couple of his scouts are gonna find Lee's battle plans, his thoughts on paper, and they don't get to McClellan in time. Imagine having the other team's playbook in front of you, but it never gets there. What we're going to see is at Antietam, McClellan has to win. He has to stop Lee. But Lee's simply outfoxing him. He's outthinking him at every turn. McClellan has to use the advantages he does have. So let me ask, what do we know as an advantage the North has? People. Numbers. McClellan has to rely on his superior numbers. But this is a big problem. Lee moves on Antietam. McClellan has to stop him. He has to win. So he's going to send wave after wave after wave of men into quite literally the jaws of death. We are going to see at Antietam the single bloodiest day in American military history. When McClellan makes his choice to win at all costs, we have a big problem as far as casualties are concerned. Now, I do want to kind of take this opportunity to sort of compare and contrast. Does the South have the numbers that the North does? No, not even close. Can they sustain losses like the North can?
No.
No, not at all. They simply don't have the manpower. They don't have the numbers to compete like that. So if McClellan is simply accepting the fact that he can throw wave after wave after wave of men against the South, what should Lee do here? Can he do the same thing? No, not going to happen. You can't sustain that. It's not going to work. You'll get annihilated. When McClellan seems to be hell-bent on doing this, Lee's got a choice to make. Yes, ma'am?
Set up defensive borders.
Oh, absolutely. Certainly. You got to be way more defensive than you usually are. The thing is, even that simply can't sustain against the overwhelming numbers. What we're going to see at Antietam is 23,000 casualties in one day. 23,000 casualties in one day. The single bloodiest day in the history of the American military. Now, just to kind of give you an idea, some comparison, the most recent wars that the United States has fought in Afghanistan and Iraq combined has had about, and you got to kind of give or take, about 13,000 casualties. This day had 10,000 more casualties than a war that's been going on for, give or take, almost 20 years. That's what we see at Antietam in one day. Now, as we've talked about, Lee simply can't sustain these kind of numbers. It's not going to happen. So what's his only option? Fall back. Get out of there. If McClellan's hell-bent on sacrificing lives like this, don't play his game. Wait for another opportunity. Be patient. Lee falls back into Virginia. So let's kind of take a look at what we have here. Does the North win at Antietam?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. You win.